Welcome to 1 hour webinar. I hope that was a nice intro to what we're discussing today, and we'll come back to that in a minute. We'll have another look at it. So I'm Anna, I'm your host for this 1 hour webinar. Welcome to the 112 of us who are online. We will first introduce the panelists. So Giels, would you like to say hello?
Hi everyone, my name is Gijs Dierks, which is always a difficult name, so go for Gijs, that's easiest to remember. I'm a senior researcher and advisor at DRIFT, which is the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions, based at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And I always mediated in between science and practice. I have my PhD in transition studies at Imperial College in London, and now I'm back in the Netherlands. And at DRIFT, I'm really at my place because we really try to occupy that space in between science and practice, not only trying to understand transitions, but also wanting them to accelerate and steer them towards a more sustainable trajectory. So I'm happy to be part of this panel and talk about rock and roll.
Thank you. Sophie.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Sophie Buchel. I'm a colleague of Gijs, also working at DRIFT as an action researcher, activist researcher, consultant, educator, and based in Rotterdam. And I'm working on sustainable and just transitions, mainly in the mobility and food systems.
Thank you. And Garrett.
I'm Garrett from Glider, who are the visual storytellers of the series. I'm the project lead and one of the creative strategists in the project team, together with the founder and creative director Lecky and Jethro, who is our motion maverick. Glider is a conceptual studio that works at the intersection of human futures, transformation, and experience design. So we work with a wide range of organizations, NGOs, research orgs, foundations, on the big issues shaping our futures, everything from climate change and social inclusion and human rights to ethics and philanthropy and international relations. So ultimately all of our work comes down to inspiring meaningful conversations and creating forums for that conversation, whether they be digital or physical. And this particular project is is a passion of ours, and we really are excited to be here, participating in the webinar, and excited to see where else this series will go.
Brilliant. Thank you, Garrett. And I'm Anna Birney. I am the director at Forum for the Future, looking at systems change, and also run the School of Systems Change. So this is a series of 3 webinars looking at how stories of change can help us understand systems change, a very kind of nebulous, kind of out there concept. And we really wanted to help people engage with these stories through frameworks, but also through exciting stories. So those of you who were able to join us at the very beginning saw the video that Garrett was talking about, and we will share that again for those of you who missed it. So why use frameworks and stories of change to understand systems change? Well, frameworks help us organize our thinking. They help us see we can't actually understand the complexity of this world. We need kind of frameworks and an easily way to access, kind of try to understand that kind of complexity, the dynamics of the messiness of the world as it really is. So sometimes frameworks can help us just organize our thinking, but we also want to help us understand change that needs to happen at a large scale, a systems level. And to really understand some of these big challenges we're facing. So at Forum for the Future, we work on climate change. We're looking at issues of social justice, across the food systems, energy systems. So how do we understand it at this really large scale? And how do we make sure that we work with the dynamics of change? So really work with change that is moving, is in dynamics. So stories are in themselves dynamic things. They are telling a story, helps us work with narratives and ways of things changing. So we really offer this as a tool, and we will kind of have a few panelists talking about a few questions I'll ask them. We'll then re-show the video, and you can have a look at it, and then we'll break you into smaller groups to have a little conversation about how does this stimulate your thinking and what does it mean for you, before sort of ending on any of your questions. But also we're launching a facilitation pack for you to take away from this and to use this video and to use the facilitation pack and to dig a little deeper. So this is really just a taster, a little flavor of kind of these things. And we offer deeper tasters and programs that you can look at the School of Systems Change website. So the multi-level perspective is the framework that we're using to understand the story of rock and roll. And in some ways, it's very simple. Change happens at 3 different levels, multi-level perspective. It happens at different scales and different altitudes. Really looking at the regime, the current system, the current way, the day-to-day, the status quo and our practices is set, and how that is sort of structurally in one direction. We really understand the bigger landscape on which we're operating, the mega trends. Climate change is one of those bigger mega changes that might create shocks to the system. COVID was kind of one of those big shocks to the systems that sort of changed the way we work. And we're really trying to understand the niche, the small little innovations, the technical innovations that try to disrupt and try to influence and come into the regime that creates this systems change. So how can we understand, this is the framework that we're trying to understand rock and roll through. So I'm going to turn to Gilles and sort of ask him, why is this tool useful for understanding the story of rock and roll?
So I'm not sure if it's just me, but that the connection was a bit poor with you, but the question was why the framework is useful to understand the story of rock and roll. Well, what I like about the story is that it's about popular culture. So most people have an opinion, an informed opinion about it, or at least an educated guess, because it's about music. They know something about it, and if it's older generations, they have an emotional connection to it. So when you ask people like, why did rock and roll come about, you get pretty good answers. So people will point towards Elvis and say it's his genius, his talent and creativity that basically, he as an innovator, disrupted the music industry. Or you have people pointing towards electric guitar, saying this is a new technology that created a space for experimentation, and people developed a new sound around this new technology. Or more informed people would also point towards the fact that rock and roll didn't come out of nowhere, and that it builds on a lot of experimentation with music in rhythm and blues and country and western. So that there's also a lot of social innovation that's involved in this story. And another thing people might say is, well, it's also a sign of the times. It's this zeitgeist. It's the coming of age of a post-war generation that wanted to rebel and then use music as a way to express their own identity. And what's appealing of the MLP in explaining this story is that it gives a place to all these elements. So it would say you have these landscape developments. It's the post-war generation, I think, is a good example of that puts pressure on the system, and that then it opens up a space for new practices and new type of music. And you have these niches, the technological niches, the electric guitar, but also the social niches, the rhythm and blues and country and western. And both create seeds of change and create the ability of a system to change. But another thing that's really appealing about the MLP, in my perspective, is that it not only looks at these dynamics of change, but it puts the regime front and center of the analysis. So it also really looks at these dynamics of stability. And all of a sudden, it reframes the question. So it's not only about why did rock and roll come about, but it's more about like, why the hell did swing music remain so popular for such a long time? And then you look at the story from a different perspective, and you think, okay, it's more about power dynamics in society. And all of a sudden, you talk about these powerful music producing companies. They were actually called the empires of sound, which I think in itself is a really cool name to discuss these power relations. And that shines a new light on this story of how systems actually change. And it's not only about looking at innovations and novelty, but also about the persisting system and how it's stable and how it can be disrupted. And just to add one more thing to that, all of a sudden you get new explanations that most people won't know that have been that influential. And I just want to highlight one, and that's the introduction of the television. And it has been very influential in shaping rock and roll, and not because it provided a platform for these novelties, but that it disrupted the status quo. So with the introduction of the television, the radio moved from the living room to the bedroom, into the garage, and all of a sudden it was not the main platform where you would broadcasting companies would distribute their music to, and they didn't have to cater to the masses, but they could cater to niches. And then all of a sudden it provided the conditions for music to change and for rock and roll to break through.
Brilliant, thank you. We're really starting to see the kind of the connections between the different elements of our society, and it's not just one thing that changes. And Sophie, what does the MLP reveal for you about the story of rock and roll? What does it stand out? What's your standout elements of the story?
Yeah, thanks. What stands out to me is really that these icons of rock and roll that we all know about, like the electric guitar and this new sound, or Elvis as a performer, or other Chuck Berry, other pioneers, they didn't really come out of nowhere. They actually built on these long traditions of music styles that were developed in the fringes by marginalized communities, like the rhythm and blues and country and western sounds that were actually developed by Black communities or by rural white communities. And these people were innovating with music for decades before this breakthrough of rock and roll, right? And it was really when these new smaller radio stations started exploring these styles and playing them to different smaller audiences, that artists like Elvis were inspired by the sounds that they heard and created all of these new, the new styles that then were kind of explosive in the form of rock and roll. So I guess the model really gives a lens to look at how important those niches are, right? Even when they seem very small and marginal, actually they all contribute to the development of something that can actually break through when the time is ripe because of these landscape or regime pressures or instabilities. And yeah, like Kai said, something as seemingly sort of irrelevant, like new TV technology that was broadcasting not music at all, but something completely different types of entertainment and news, had a profound impact because listening to the radio became such a private endeavor, and because young people who were restless, like the video said, they kind of discovered their own music and started buying their own records again, and that was something that hadn't happened in a long time.
And Garrett, we've been trying to use stories and kind of frameworks as ways for education and learning and to engage people. So as one of the creators of the video itself, kind of why do you see that, you know, how does it help people work with system change from your kind of perspective?
Yeah, I think there's quite a few things at play that that help make these materials resonate. I think the story is unexpected in this context. You know, it feels visually distinct from columns in the space, and it distills complexity to its kind of most essential words and forms. And that graphic, you know, every graphic mark and image is imbued with kind of is a carrier of the story. And those are things that are both kind of consciously and unconsciously understood when you watch it. The music also plays a big part in terms of evoking emotion and connecting at a deeper, more human level to bring people to a particular time and place. And I think that is one of the, you know, the reasons that it works as well. And the script was written as lyrics to kind of mirror that rhythm and cadence of the story. Because, you know, I guess as the adage goes, you can, you know, you can tell a story quite powerfully with very, you know, with few words. I think we had 1,200 words in the first version of the script, and there's 200 in the final video. So, yeah, it is quite amazing the complexity of a story you can tell. Then the graphic language that is sort of, you know, that weaves together and wraps around the other aspects of the video is what tightens the connection between the story and the framework, between the video and the course materials. and those are designed specifically to be universal, i.e. identifiable kind of across the set, but also endemic to the story. So to have, using things that emulate music notes and the records and things that visuals that will stick in people's minds. And it's this sort of distillation and meaning making and repetition that makes it memorable, so that these stories can then can be active tools for change, that people will remember them and be able to can apply them to the challenges that they face. So opening up new conversations, deepening our understanding, building also our collective confidence that change is possible, and that we can become agents of it. So I think there's an inherent hope and optimism in the series as well, underpinned by a strong belief that showing change can inspire change. So yeah, I think there's, in terms of what factors kind of come together to make it a powerful tool for education.
Brilliant, thank you. So what we're going to do in a moment is move to watch the video again. And I'm going to ask each of you as panelists kind of what is your kind of takeaway from it? So, what have you, when you watch it, are you going to take away? And then when we invite you to watch it, it's almost like, can you see this story differently through the MLP, through rock and roll, and really kind of engage with it at that kind of level? So, for me, the big takeaway, whenever I use this as a training tool, is I guess there's something about the development of teenagers and kind of taking things into, I always love that story about taking things into the garage, about technology and how they play with the bigger landscape level pressures of the World War II, of kind of moving cultural and social cultural movements. So there's something about really playing together technology and social culture and how they play off each other that is a big takeaway for me. And just reminding myself not to get caught on Elvis, like Elvis is just a moment in time. I think that's a really key takeaway for me. So Giels, what's the one thing that you kind of take away when you watch this?
Yeah, I think it's in line with what you said at the end, that I mean, the disruption of the music industry seemed sudden, right? All of a sudden, there was rock and roll, and the game was changed basically. But if you really want to understand the story, you have to go back like 2-3 decades, and that tells you a lot about how system change actually happens. They take a long time to materialize, and it takes a lot of factors to come together to actually have that sudden disruptive expression. I think that's my main takeaway.
Great, thanks. Sophie?
Yeah, I think it really highlights how also the political landscape and like you said, these changes kind of in era ripple down into something like music, which was previously quite detached from politics and quite middle of the road. And now suddenly became a vehicle kind of for a new generation to express themselves. And then actually in the 60s grew to sort of mature and influence politics in return with the civil rights movement and, the development of rock really as a genre that was also critical of the political establishment. So that back and forth between the landscape and the niche through music and politics is really interesting for me.
And Garrett?
I think for me, in this, particularly in this time, there's definitely something encouraging in the fact that our actions do add up. That the bubbling of innovation and new form can become the new norm. That the change is. We think of these systems as entrenched and immovable, but the change that starts at the margins, coalesces and becomes the new norm and shifts perspectives and shapes new narratives and becomes the future. So I think that's really, it's quite a hopeful story in this time as well, because I think we tend to be working in transformation. We're often reminded of how blinkered as a society we become, and we tend to forget that there is another way. And as soon as you can lift someone's head up and kind of bring form to what's possible, that change suddenly becomes slightly less daunting, or you feel that you do have agency. And so I think that's a really great message, especially in these times.
Great, thank you. Yeah, multi-level perspective is MLP. Thanks for that question, because I know some of you are joining. So what we're going to do now is watch again to the video. But when you're watching it, really think about, okay, what's happening at the level? What's happening in the regime? What's happening at the niche? Or what does it stimulate for you in terms of just anything, in terms of what is it meaning? And then we're going to break you into groups to have a quick conversation, but really do prepare your questions. So when we come back out of the groups, we'll have a bit more, we're hopefully trying to have a bit of a question, and we'll get the chat moving as well. Great. So we're now going to randomly fling you into groups of 3 or 4 people, however many ends up in the random selection. And in that, we'd love you just to have a quick conversation with the people you find there about what insights does this multi-level perspective, rock and roll story, the video tell you about how we understand some of these big social, environmental, sustainability challenges of our time, and what does it mean for how we might transition? So big question. But we're going to ask you to go in and then just bring back any questions you have. Please do share your questions, and we'll try to facilitate some questions and answers with you out of that conversation. So what would be great is if you want to share, either maybe put an I for an insight or Q for a question into the chat box, and we can start to have a bit of a conversation, and we can sort of share where people are. So welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us and remaining with us for the last sort of 20 minutes. We're moving into kind of really hearing what your insights were, an I for insight in the chat box or a Q for question, and we can start to have a bit more of a conversation between us through the chat box and through, everyone's just joining in now. It's taking time. I'll repeat myself. So there was a question before we broke up about the multi-level perspective and the resource. What does it look like? We're going to share. The resource pack and the facilitators pack, which we're putting online as an open resource. So you can go and have a look at that. The video is on YouTube, is on our website, so you can also use that. So this is really about helping you start using this material in your own, whatever your work is. But we've kind of dropped down to about 75 people, which is still large. So to manage that number of people, if you could put an I for an interesting insight you had, or a Q for a question you have, and we can start to answer or try to have as much as a conversation as we can do in the chat box and responding to it. Yeah, is Greta Thunberg the new Elvis? Who knows? You know, wealth and World War II, uprising. Yeah, what is the current uprising? What is the current time? I think the ideas of our time. So any questions as well? Yeah, can it help it look forward? This is a great question. This is the question we get asked a lot. Like, so we can understand change that just happened, right? Does it help us be both? Can it help us look forward? And can it help us be intentional about change? Can it help us actually create change? And that's the assumption, but I don't know if others, Yields or Sophie, or want to say anything about how does this help us look into the future and create change? One of you jump.
All right, I'll go for it. Yeah, I think that what we always start with transition studies is understanding where the system actually is now stable and where the unsustainability persists. And that really helps in then defining what desired future you want to achieve and what current like niches do you already see around you, like what dynamics are already there in society that can help you move towards that desired future. But the MLP is really a useful tool to start with defining that unsustainability, and from there discuss which desired future you want to achieve and how the current system is actually inhibiting you to go there, and what already is there in practice that can lead us towards that desired future.
And I know in our work in Forum for the Future, we use it as both a diagnostic tool to understand how change is happening at the moment, to really understand like where is change happening, where can we notice change? And we also use it as a way to then strategize and saying, well, where do we want to intervene? Like, and there's lots of questions now coming up about that. Now, Serena, can we actually show the slide again? People would love to see the slide again. We've had that about 3 or 4 times. So just to remind ourselves what that slide looks like in terms of the multi-level perspective. So here it is. And there was a question really about how, there was a question emerging, a couple of questions about, you know, what's the relationship between the niche? How do niches break out of a niche? And there was a question about networks and how do you enable networks? Personally, Sophie, I'm going to come to you in a second, but personally, when we've been looking at it, people think, you know, this idea of scale, whereas actually what this image starts looking at is that actually change doesn't happen just by scaling. It happens by this interesting interaction between the niche, the kind of the reorganizing of the system, the rechanging of the system. But Sophie, have you got anything to say about the relationship between the niche and how it becomes the regime and what happens there?
Sure. I think one of the things to really take away from this model, it's really just like Gijs and Anna, you already said, a way of a lens through which to see the world and trying to understand the system that you're trying to change, because understanding it as well as you can possibly can is the first step, I think, to changing it. But it's that there's not one niche really, or one innovation that's going to really shift our systems, right? It's all of these different innovations at once. And what we saw in rock and roll is that on the one hand, there's all these new technologies in instruments, in recording technologies, in the way radio is produced. But there's also these social innovations that have much more to do with like how families consume entertainment, how the leisure time that people had, that was mentioned in the chat as well. So there's all of these different dynamics happening at once. And you can then also try to see what does the regime actually look like? So not just focusing in on all of these new innovations, but also what are the structures that maybe stand in the way of change, and where are there already, where is it destabilizing maybe a little bit already?
Great, thank you. And there's some interesting questions, I think, that are related to the dominance and power, actually. So people are talking about echo chambers, about atomization, you know, like how much it gets co-opted. And I guess there's a question about how well this works with those power dynamics, and how, you know, how, and in the story, we were looking at the difference between racial dynamics and why did a white man become the hero of rock and roll. And there's some really interesting tensions in this about working with social cultural issues of power and dominance. And I don't know if there's any comment you want to make on that, Sophie, and maybe come back to you, Hughes, as well.
Yeah, I think those are really interesting questions, and sometimes yeah, it happens that a co-option is not uncommon in transition, I would say. Usually when niches scale or are adopted by the regime or influenced by the, taken up by the regime, they change in some way. Some would see that as co-option, because maybe certain more powerful groups in society take something on that was before something that marginalized people owned or created. Yeah, sometimes it's maybe less of a power struggle, but there will still be changes. You can see this even in solar energy, for example, in the energy transition right now. It was something that eco-villages and self-sustainable communities were experimenting with, and now it's very large scale, mostly produced by large Chinese companies. There's some people would view that as a loss of certain values that used to be attached to that kind of energy production that was communally done, and now maybe has a different role. So yeah, I would say there's always some shift, and it's really important also if you're working on transitions or you're maybe running a niche or involved in a niche yourself, to kind of identify what is this radical core or your core values that you attach to your niche that you want to remain the same, and what are the things that you can maybe let go in this process of scaling.
Some really good questions also actually in the chat. Just to go on the echo chambers and the social media, and whether that can be compared to the radio moving to the different rooms in the house. I think it's definitely the case that there's a disruption of the current media landscape. And the question then is, of course, will this lead to a desired transition or an undesired transition? We tend to think in terms of desired transitions, but it's also interesting to do this thought exercise about whether all transitions are the ones we actually want to see in the world, or are we also seeing some maybe undesired transitions taking place? There was one other question I wanted to reply to. Oh yeah, Brad was asking about what disruptions are most obvious, and hinting towards that technology can obviously be disruptive. And I agree that technology can be very disruptive, but it's also our default go-to. We think of technologies as disrupting our society, and then society adapting to that change. But social changes can be disruptive as well. And just to give one example, if you go back to the 70s and the 80s and they think about the office of the future, they have all these visions about how new technologies will shape the way we work. But in all these visions, there are no women in the workplace. But fast forward 20 years in time, and it's actually that social disruption that I think changed the way we work much more than all these technologies that they were foreseeing.
And I think a lot of these questions, and should we drop the image now as well, so we can at least see people if they're there? Thanks, Serena. I think a lot of these changes, this is something about the frameworks and what a framework's useful for. It only is seeing the change through one lens, like one lens of these different levels. It doesn't necessarily show us it doesn't necessarily just determine how we create change, and we have to really think about our own intentionality in that. And I think that question about how do we really cultivate maybe niches or marginalized people or areas that we see as really aligning with our values or what we want to see in the world, and how do we create protective spaces for them or support them, is really important. So I think this doesn't answer the question about what your intention is or how you create change. It just gives you a model to understand what might happen and understand what the problems might be, just as much as how you might use this. So it's not a blueprint for how you create change. It's just a model to kind of get your head into some of these questions are brilliant. And so at the School of System Change, we might use a model like this and teach you about that. But actually, we might also bring in, okay, well, what is your intent and purpose here? What do you want to bring into this system? How can you work with issues of power? So these frameworks don't do everything. They're only one slice into the world as well. So we just need to kind of remembering that. And then Tara, that's completely right. You know, we're working with multiple niches and regimes. So again, we can't view them from one angle. And I think there was an earlier question. There was an earlier question about the difference between regime and landscape. I know that's quite a technical question, but I don't know if one of you want to answer that question as well.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question because it tells you a lot about what the MLP actually is. And the MLP is nothing more than a framework, a lens through which we see society, or we look at society to interpret change. And the difference between landscape and regime is partly the system boundaries you draw, right? So you look at a particular system. Now we looked at the music system, and then all these developments that are outside our system boundaries, but that still affect the system, we call them landscape changes. They are exogenous forces to the system. But if you redraw the system boundaries, that difference between landscape and regime obviously changes. So there are some more academic terms for that. I think it's about the ontology of an MLP, but I won't go into the detail. But it's really, I think it's a very intelligent question in that respect.
Yeah. And if I always think of the landscape as almost like inverting it by saying we're on the landscape, you know, when the ground rumbles, the rest also rumbles. So it's just not the dominant river basin, it's just the ground on which we're standing. So any other questions if I've missed any or we haven't seen them? And I think, yeah, so it could be interesting to bring in the cube power analysis. So brilliant, this is exactly what we want. People can bring in different tools, different analysis, and actually the framework is always wrong. The framework is always wrong. It is just some frameworks are more useful than others for what you need to be looking at. So bringing that discernment is absolutely brilliant. So it's great to see you all kind of critiquing it, because then we can use it with better ability. Anything else in terms of engaging people? Like, it'd be great to know, just as maybe as it's starting to think about the checkout for this just 1 hour webinar, like, where do people want to use this? Maybe share in your chat, like, where do you see this being used or to help you? You know, we designed these tools to really help people engage with these difficult concepts. And just to remind people, we are putting and publishing online a facilitations pack. And in that facilitation pack, there's linked both the story of rock and roll, the academic of multi-level perspective, some of the ways you might be able to communicate and engage people in that. So, you know, we're providing a bit of a tool for you to help use this in your day-to-day. So, yeah, the toolkit, I don't know if we can provide the link to the toolkit here or if it's just on our website. Yeah, so any other, just sharing maybe some insights. Yeah, Brexit, like, what does this mean for Brexit? And that's the thing, you can use this tool to start from anywhere. So anything, Garrett, do you want to say that you've reflected on here? Where are you, Garrett? Have we lost you?
No.
There you are.
At the moment.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. And Sophie, do you want to say anything to end with?
Yeah, I really hope that this, even though it's a brief discussion and the video is quite rapid, that we've given a little bit of background for you to work with. And I really hope some of you find it inspiring, also looking at the facilitation pack, to use it in your own practice. Because even if this is the first time maybe you're hearing the story of rock and roll, or this is the first time you're getting acquainted with the model, I think it's a quite accessible way to get people into a sort of playful systems thinking mindset that they can then take to whatever systems or transitions you're working on yourself. And I think most of us are all trying to change the world in some way. And this is just a really easy couple of steps to try and explore together with a group or with your colleagues or whoever you're working with. So it's an invitation also from us to just try it out and see if it applies to your context.
Yields, anything to finish on?
No, not much to add. I wish I was as fast. I was faster with typing because there are really some interesting discussions going on in the chat. Yeah, I hope this gives you a new perspective on rock and roll, because that's already, of course, what we started with. But more importantly, that this brought you a new perspective on the sustainability challenges you're dealing with, and so that it can really inspire looking at a challenge from a different point of view, and that maybe opens up some new options for action, because that's what we're obviously want to achieve with this.
Yeah, brilliant. So thank you all for attending. We will be sending out emails summarizing this. Remember that we have 2 more coming up with 2 different frameworks, one about the civil rights movement and looking at the iceberg model, one about looking at regenerative model and looking at a story from Mexico and the water system there. So please do join us for those, giving us different views in different stories, different frameworks. And we will be sending out the resource pack. We will send an email out to you saying thank you and sharing what's here, and then we will be placing it up online for you to share wider. So lovely to see you all, lovely to see how you're going to be using it. Sorry we couldn't hear all your voices, but hopefully through chat and through your breakouts, it was participatory enough and engaging enough. Lovely to see you all.